What's happening, guys? So this is a video response to a question that was posed to some of us on a Facebook boxing forum last night. And the question was, who has a better resume, Joe Calzaghe or Carl Froch? Now, I left a few comments. I had a little bit of back and forth with a few people on there on my thoughts on this, because and this is something that I had actually debated with people several years ago on some of the Facebook boxing groups, because in my opinion, and I think it's pretty straightforward, to be honest, I think that Joe Calzaghe's resume clearly, in my opinion, is vastly superior to Carl Froch's resume. And again, I'm not just talking about boxing ability, I'm not talking about who I think would win, I'm talking about resume here. Calzaghe, in my opinion, has a far better resume than Carl Froch, and I plan to prove it with this video. Now, first of all, let's start by looking at the records of both guys. Now, Carl Froch, he had a record of 33-2 with 24 knockouts. Joe Calzaghe, 46-0 with 32 knockouts. Now, I want one thing to be perfectly clear with this video. I'm not here to talk about how many fights these guys had and how high the knockout percentage was and stuff like that. I'm here to discuss resume, so everything has to be taken into consideration. So the fact that Joe Calzaghe is undefeated doesn't necessarily mean that he has the better resume. The fact that he has more fights, more knockouts, again, doesn't mean that he necessarily has the better resume. But there are many other variables to this and things that I want to talk about here. Now, I want to do a quick response to Rick Taylor, who is one of the people who I talked to in the comment section of that conversation. Now, I just want to bring up a few of the points that you mentioned. Now, you talked about Carl Froch having faced the better opposition. You say that, on average, the opposition that Carl Froch fought was vastly superior to Joe Calzaghe, who I believe you said something like he had a lot of hand-picked title defenses. He had a lot of guys who Frank Warren picked to kind of showcase his ability. Now, I'm not denying that at all. When Joe Calzaghe won the WBO title, now I've spoke about in previous videos how Joe Calzaghe Frank Warren certainly has a lot of pull with the WBO. He has bribed the WBO many times to get his fighters in a ranked position to fight for it, and he seems to have a lot of pull in regards to the ranking systems and who these guys can fight. These guys seem to be able to fight guys who are not actually in the top 10, despite being the champion. So I'll agree there that a lot of the guys he did fight were certainly showcase fights. But that doesn't take away from the fact that Calzaghe does have some very, very good fights, some very, very good wins that actually went under the radar. Now, I'll mention some of the names you talked about and some of the names that you neglected to mention when you were talking about the comparison between the two and between their opponents. Now, one guy that you mentioned as being a cherry pick, I believe it was, you said that this was one of these showcase opponents, was Mario Vite, who was a guy who Joe Calzaghe fought twice. Now, it's easy to write off Mario Vite and say that it was a cherry pick because of how the fights went. But let's not forget that going into that fight against Calzaghe, the first fight, Mario Vite was undefeated in 30 fights. He was a world ranked contender, okay? He was a very, very promising contender, a very commendable fighter. He was a well-schooled boxer, okay? Let's not forget this is a guy that went on to defeat people like Jürgen Bremer, for example. So this ain't a journeyman here, okay? This is a world-ranked contender that Joe Calzaghe fought. Now, the fact that Calzaghe was able to stop Mario Vite in one round, it had a lot of people thinking that Mario Vite was basically just a showcase, as you say, a hand-picked opponent, but it doesn't take away from the fact that he was an undefeated contender and a world-ranked contender at that. It doesn't take away from the fact that he went on to be a very good contender after facing Calzaghe still. The guy had over 50 fights and 50 victories, I believe. So, I'll give you a quick example as to what I mean by that. Now, for example, Gennady Golovkin a couple of years ago fought Daniel Geale. Now, he destroyed Daniel Geale in 3 rounds and made him look like a complete bum, basically. The fight wasn't even competitive. Now, does that take away from the fact that Daniel Geale was an elite fighter? Because let's not forget, this is a guy that was a 3-time world champion, a guy who had unified titles, who had won belts on the road against commendable champions. The fact that Gennady Golovkin was able to so easily dispatch of him, it doesn't take away from the fact that it was a world class opponent. That it's a testament to how good Gennady Golovkin is. Just like being able to destroy Mario Vite so quickly was a testament to how good Joe Calzaghe was. And let's talk about it for a second, the Mario Vite fight, because I think the reason why he came unstuck against Calzaghe so quickly, so suddenly, was because he was a very conventional fighter, Mario Vite. He was very upright, a little bit stiff. He was used to that, Eastern Bloc style of fighting, very basic, very conventional, fighting a lot of the Universum fighters and whatnot. So, he had never been up against a guy as unorthodox as Calzaghe and who, could throw punches at the kind of angles that Calzaghe could. I think that Calzaghe was a very difficult guy to train for and a very difficult guy to attune to in the ring because of the angles and because of the hand speed. And it was freakish hand speed for a super middleweight. Let's be real. So, I don't think that we can really take away from some of the commendable contenders Calzaghe fought in his career. Another guy you mentioned was Jeff Lacey. And you said in the comments, I remember, that Jeff Lacey was a 16-fight novice. First of all, that is not true. Jeff Lacey had 22 professional fights before fighting Calzaghe, and he was undefeated. He had 17 knockouts, I believe it was. He was a unified world champion. Okay, he was the IBF and IBO champion. Now, he wasn't obviously him becoming the IBF champion. You could say that it was circumstantial because the IBF title was vacated by Sven Ottke. And Jeff Lacey then went on to fight Zid Vanderpool for the title. So, to take that into consideration, yeah, you could say that Jeff Lacey becoming world champion in the first place, it was kind of circumstantial. But, Sid Vanderpool wasn't a bad opponent. Okay, he was a guy who was, I believe he was 35-2, something like that. I don't have his record in front of me. I'm just remembering off the top of my head. But the guy was 35-2. He was a world ranked contender. Okay, he was in the running to fight Sven Ottke before he retired. So, Sid Vanderpool wasn't a bad opponent, and Jeff Lacey managed to stop him. Jeff Lacey too. Let's not forget he unified with Robin Reed. And that was a fight that a lot of people didn't think he'd win because Robin Reed at that point was still a world-class veteran. Okay, Robin Reed was a commendable champion at that point. So, Robin Reed, he'd been around for a long time. He was the WBC champion at one point. He had given Calzaghe nightmares in the ring. He was always a guy who people didn't want to fight because he was a high-risk, low-reward type opponent, and he wasn't an easy guy to look good against. And Jeff Lacey, he destroyed Robin Reed. He absolutely obliterated him in 7 rounds. It was a systematic destruction. He came forward and he really took Robin Reed apart on the inside and he stopped him, and it was a very commendable victory. And round about that time, nobody was able to do that to Robin Reed. It wasn't until after that fight that Robin Reed started to badly slip. So, Jeff Lacey, he wasn't this 16-fight novice that you were saying he was. He was a very good champion, okay? He was 22-0, right? Very powerful. He was... I'll agree he was overhyped, okay? The hype around him was just too big, He was being touted as the next Mike Tyson and shit like that, That was going too far, That's Americans for you. They always, when they see a little bit of talent, they see a muscle-bound fighter that's knocking people out, they get overexcited, okay? They've always been like that, American fans. So, yeah, he was overhyped, but it doesn't take away from the fact that he was a commendable champion. And Joe Calzaghe, he wasn't supposed to win that fight, okay? Many people picked Jeff Lacey to win. He was a big favourite going into the fight. So, I don't know why you're acting as if that was a cherry pick, okay? It wasn't. It was a unification. It was Joe Calzaghe's first unification against a very, very dangerous up-and-coming young champion. Fight that neither guy had to take. So, yeah, I'll commend Calzaghe for that victory. I think that Jeff Lacey, the victory over Jeff Lacey is on par with the majority of Carl Froch's victories, in my opinion. Now, talk about some of the other guys, that you didn't mention on Calzaghe's resume. Calzaghe fought Byron Mitchell. Now, Byron Mitchell, with the way that his career ended up, he was one of these guys who fought on a little bit too long, and, he ended up getting, he ended up becoming a journeyman, basically, towards the end of his career. In fact, he may even still be fighting. I don't actually know. I remember hearing something about him several years ago. He got knocked out by some unbeaten contender, but I don't know whether he's still fighting or he may have retired since then. I don't know, but I remember watching him many years ago on TV when I was a kid, and Byron Mitchell was a commendable fighter. He was a world champion at one point himself. Okay, he defeated Manny Siaka by stoppage to win the WBA world title at one point. In fact, I think he was a two-time WBA champion. And going into the fight against Joe Calzaghe, he was coming off a defeat to Sven Ottke just several months earlier. I think it was like 3 months prior to that, he'd lost to Sven Ottke on points. But Joe Calzaghe was able to take him out in 2 rounds. And that was a fight that, in my opinion, really showcased Joe Calzaghe's resilience and his durability, because he got knocked down in the second round heavily. I mean, he took a huge fucking right hand. And he got up and just obliterated the guy, just swung for him and just threw everything but the kitchen sink at him, and had him out on his feet and stopped him, and managed to put him down as well. So, Byron Mitchell, being a two-time world champion, a guy that was 6'2", who had a lot of knockout power, that's a very commendable fight. Okay, a very commendable victory for Joe Calzaghe. Okay, I don't know why people never bring that fight up when they do these resume comparisons. Okay, Byron Mitchell was a commendable victory. You also had Richie Waddell, who was a former champion prior to fighting Joe Calzaghe. Remember, that was considered a very big domestic dust-up. Richie Waddell to this day, a lot of people seem to forget about that fight with Calzaghe. A lot of people, again, when they do these resume comparisons, one thing I consistently hear is that Calzaghe, he fought all these bums, all these guys from overseas, these bottom top 20 ranked contenders that Frank Warren handpicked for him. Let's not forget, this guy was a very commendable opponent. People always seem to forget about the Richie Waddell fight, but again, that's another former world champion. Okay, Calzaghe, I believe in his reign as a WBO super middleweight champion, he fought something like 6 or 7 former world champions prior to his unification with Lacey. So, you have to take all this into consideration. He's fought a lot of former champions. I mean, I haven't even mentioned the Chris Eubank fight yet, and I'll agree Chris Eubank was a little bit past his prime, but he could still handle himself. He was still dangerous, and he was, he went into that fight with a vast advantage in experience. He'd had a lot more fights. He'd been in there with all the top British fighters like Nigel Benn and Steve Collins and whatnot. So, Joe Calzaghe went into that fight as basically a prospect, a domestic level fighter whose only real accolade was winning the British super middleweight title. So yeah, Chris Eubank was in my opinion, at that point in Joe Calzaghe's career, was a very commendable victory. So, these are all fights that people don't take into consideration. Now, I haven't even mentioned about the big fights yet, okay? Joe Calzaghe fought Sakio Bika, who at the time was 20-1, and this is the same Sakio Bika who went on years later to give Andre Ward a very difficult fight, a very close fight. And I understand the scoring was one-sided, but anybody that watched that fight knows that it was really a close fight. Sakio Bika was a nightmare for anybody to fight, okay? The guy was very tough. He was very wily, he was very durable. He was a spoiler. He was strong physically. He could push you around in the ring. He was dirty, very rough. And Joe Calzaghe, that was a commendable victory for Joe Calzaghe against Sakio Bika. And, he then went on to, I believe it was Peter Manfredo. Yeah, Peter Manfredo, he ain't really nothing. He's basically just a fringe contender. And then that was when Joe Calzaghe had his big unification fight, his consolidation fight, basically, to become the undisputed champion, unifying all the belts. And that was his fight against Mikkel Kessler. Now, this is the same Mikkel Kessler who to this day is considered Carl Froch's best or second best, depending on who you ask, victory. Now, at the time that Mikkel Kessler fought Joe Calzaghe, that was back in 2007, November in 2007, I believe it was. And Mikkel Kessler was 28 years old. He was 39-0, undefeated, had a big knockout percentage. He was a unified world champion. He was the WBA and WBC champion. And, he went into that fight. The odds for that fight were very close. A lot of people felt Mikkel Kessler had a good chance. And it was, a fight for all the marbles, okay, all the belts in the division, even though I know the IBF belt went vacant I don't actually remember why that was, but for whatever reason, Calzaghe vacated that belt. But we all know that he was the unified champion, he was the undisputed, well, both guys had held all those belts in concession and no one had taken them off them. So on paper, in reality, it was for the unified, undisputed super middleweight championship, basically. So yeah, Mikkel Kessler, Joe Calzaghe handily beat Mikkel Kessler. The fight was not competitive. It was very one-sided, other than I believe the fourth round where Kessler hurt him with an uppercut. Other than that, the fight was very one-sided. Calzaghe handily outboxed Kessler. He outworked him on the inside. He dominated the fight. It was a clear victory for Joe Calzaghe. And, he even roughed Kessler up a little bit, who was supposed to be the stronger guy and the more powerful guy. So, yeah, the most commendable victory, depending on who you ask, on Froch's resume, was a piece of cake for Joe Calzaghe when the guy was at his prime. Okay, Mikkel Kessler was at his prime when he fought Calzaghe. When Carl Froch fought Mikkel Kessler and lost, Mikkel Kessler was coming off a fight against Andre Ward where he suffered 3 cuts. And prior to fighting Carl Froch, Mikkel Kessler couldn't even spar. The guy couldn't even train properly because he was nursing those 3 horrible cuts where he got his fucking eyes and chin bashed in by Andre Ward's head for 11 rounds, which fucking made his vision go blurry, and he was having problems with his eyes. So going into the fight against Froch, that was a very, very unprepared, clumsy version of Mikkel Kessler, and he was able to defeat Carl Froch. So again, we're doing this resume comparison. Let's keep it in mind. Let's bear it in mind that one of Froch's most commendable victories, which was a revenge fight of a guy who had already beaten him, is a guy that was a piece of cake for Joe Calzaghe. Okay, and Joe Calzaghe schooled him to unify the division. After fighting Mikkel Kessler, which was for all the belts, like I said, Joe Calzaghe had then become the undisputed super middleweight champion. There was no one left for him to fight. He had consolidated the belts. He was number one. He was the man to beat. He decided to move up and challenge Bernard Hopkins for the ring light heavyweight title, something that Carl Froch, by the way, refused to do. Okay, Carl Froch never wanted to fight Bernard Hopkins, and I may even do another video on that. Carl Froch actually, he turned down several offers to fight Bernard Hopkins over the years. So yeah, that was a fight he didn't want. Carl Froch obviously didn't want the embarrassment of losing to another fighter that lost to Joe Calzaghe. So yeah, Joe Calzaghe, and of course he had a showcase fight at the end of his career with Roy Jones. You don't really have to count that because Roy Jones was past his prime, but still, the way that Calzaghe beat him, I think Calzaghe, he was messing around in that fight, and he really played with Roy Jones and had fun in there. So yeah, that was just a showcase fight to end his career. But whatever. Let's talk about Carl Froch's resume, shall we? Let's get down to it. So when Joe Calzaghe retired in 2008, after moving up to light heavyweight the year prior to that, that was when Carl Froch was able to challenge for the vacant WBC super middleweight title. Now, I remember that fight very well. I was living in Nottingham at the time. I believe it was around December. Joe Calzaghe fought Jean Pascal for the vacant WBC super middleweight title. Now, I give Froch a lot of credit for the Pascal victory because back then Pascal was an undefeated contender. He was an up-and-coming fighter. He'd shown a lot of potential. He was a very good amateur. And, John Pascal, we know that he went on to become a champion at light heavyweight. So that was a very commendable victory. We'll give Carl Froch the Jean Pascal victory as one of his one of his first showcase fights, basically. Well, one of his first big fights against a good opponent. Now, after winning the belt, he went on to fight Jermaine Taylor. Now, Jermaine Taylor is not a commendable victory at all, and I'll explain why, okay? This is the same Jermaine Taylor who was a middleweight, who had lost 2 of his last 3 fights prior to fighting Carl Froch. One of them was a devastating knockout to Kelly Pavlik. The other one was a schooling off of Kelly Pavlik. This is the same Jermaine Taylor who was handily outboxed against Corey Spinks, and he was bailed out by the judges. He was handily outboxed by, or in my opinion anyway, he was outboxed by Winky Wright, a fight that ended up a draw. I thought that was disgraceful. I personally thought that Winky Wright had clearly won that fight. Jermaine Taylor was one of these fighters who his prime was very short-lived. He defeated Bernard Hopkins by 2 close, controversial decisions. And ever since that, he basically flopped. Jermaine Taylor, in my opinion, he was just he was a guy who got lucky. He got the fight at the right time against Bernard Hopkins, who was struggling to make weight. He was 40 years old, and I think that Bernard Hopkins, who we all knew was actually a natural light heavyweight anyway, I think that Bernard Hopkins was on his way out of the middleweight division. He had outgrown the division, and I just think that he couldn't really pull the trigger like he needed to defeat a fighter like Taylor, who was very young and athletic. So I don't really rate Jermaine Taylor as a fighter. I think that Carl Froch got lucky in the fight too, because let's not forget, Carl Froch was on the canvas. He was getting outboxed. He was missing all kinds of punches. He was looking very average, very clumsy. And it wasn't really until the 12th round where Taylor had completely run out of gas. And we all knew that Jermaine Taylor had problems making weight. He had problems with his stamina. He'd shown stamina issues in previous fight. He had problems with his chin. And Carl Froch, being the bigger man, the better athlete than Taylor, he basically just, he outlasted Taylor. That's what he did. He outlasted him, and he just hung around, and he grit his teeth, and he got the stoppage. So yeah, but that to me isn't a commendable victory at all. I don't rate Jermaine Taylor. I think he was massively overhyped after the Bernard Hopkins victory. And yeah, I think that was a fight that Carl Froch, it really exposed a lot of his shortcomings. Now, after that fight, he went on to fight Andre Dirrell. Now, Andre Dirrell had only 18 fights at that point. He had never even had a 12-rounder before, which is important. He was very inexperienced. Okay, the best guy that Andre Dirrell had fought was Curtis Stevens at that point, who was only really a middleweight, who had no business at super middleweight. So yeah, Andre Dirrell going into that fight was still a prospect basically, and he beat Carl Froch. He beat Carl Froch handily. I don't care what anybody says. The fight was not close. It was not competitive. Go and look at the fight in slow motion. Look at the official punch stats. Andre Dirrell highly landed so many more punches than Froch. I mean, it was unreal. I mean, he completely took Froch apart using old school, technical boxing. He moved away, he outboxed him, he used the quicker hands, he used feints. Even up close, Carl Froch didn't know what to do. He was too wide, leaving himself wide open. And Andre Dirrell just completely gave him a boxing lesson. It was very one-sided. It was a very one-sided fight. It was a disgraceful decision. I was in Nottingham that night, and I remember watching it thinking, wow, this dude, he's overrated. Carl Froch, again, that fight exposed a lot of his shortcomings. And again, Andre Dirrell was not a world-class fighter. He's not a world-class fighter, guys, okay? He's a guy who was a very good athlete. He was very fast, but he really didn't have the full package. He wasn't really a puncher, didn't really have much heart, couldn't really dig deep in fights. And we found out that Andre Dirrell was really just a promising athlete, if anything. He really wasn't much of a fighter. We found out how his career went since then. So, again, I don't really think that a gift decision against someone like Andre Dirrell is really a commendable victory. I really don't. His next fight was against Mikkel Kessler. He lost the fight. Again, that was Mikkel Kessler coming off one of the most horrendous beatings of his career, where he got headbutted to death, and he couldn't even spar, couldn't even train properly. He was partially blind in one eye. He was cutting too easily. Kessler was a shell of his former self going into that fight, and he still managed to outwork, outbox, and beat Carl Froch on points. All right, and yeah, he won the fight clearly. Okay, it wasn't a robbery as Carl Froch claimed it was. Kessler outlanded him. Kessler landed the more significant punches. It's just that Kessler, he got caught with too many punches himself, here and there because of his slow reflexes as a result of what happened against Ward. So, again, it was a good fight. It was an entertaining fight. I watched it live, but it wasn't really. I mean, you have to take it into consideration that this is a guy who Joe Calzaghe fought when he was at his prime, and Joe Calzaghe was able to handily beat. So yeah, it's not really a commendable achievement losing to Mikkel Kessler in regards to this comparison. So yeah, he lost to Mikkel Kessler in Denmark. After that, he then fought Arthur Abraham. Now, Arthur Abraham, you can give Froch whatever credit you want for that victory. It was a very good performance. Arthur Abraham, what Froch basically did in that fight was he figured out very early on that while Arthur Abraham covers up, there really isn't much coming back. So he found an exploit to, get his jab going, and then when Arthur Abraham is covering up to block the jab, because Froch obviously had a much longer arms, he had the height and reach advantage. He could then hook punches around the guard, he could go to the body, and he could just completely outbox Arthur Abraham from the outside. And it was a good performance. Arthur Abraham is certainly a very durable, very tough, very hard puncher. And yeah, that was one of Froch's more commendable victories. I'll give him credit for that. That was a good performance. And it's on par with some of Calzaghe's good performances, but not certainly not like Calzaghe's best victories, his biggest, like his big unifications and whatnot. It certainly doesn't compare to any of them. Now, his next opponent was Glenn Johnson. Glenn Johnson is a journeyman, guys. Okay, at this stage, he's a journeyman. Okay, this is not the Glenn Johnson from the early 2000s, or the Glenn Johnson that fought Roy Jones Jr. and Antonio Tarver and whatnot. This is a much older, slower, more lethargic version of Glenn Johnson. Okay, he had 15 losses prior to facing Carl Froch. He was coming off a knockout victory against Alan Green, but Alan Green was a shower of shit, let's be honest. Okay, the guy had no chin and no stamina, so, the fact that Glenn Johnson was able to outwork him and stop him. And Alan Green, let's not forget, he quit in that fight, okay? He got caught with a shot behind the head, and he went to the floor. He really could have got up anytime. He wasn't even hurt. He was complaining to the referee, trying to get a disqualification, and the fight was over. But it wasn't a legitimate knockout. Alan Green quit. He got hit to the back of the head and he quit. That's what happened. So yeah, he tried to pull a fast one and it blew up in his face. So yeah, Glenn Johnson, prior to fighting Froch, also, not that long before then, had lost to people like Tavares Cloud, who was a fucking trash fighter. Let's be honest. Okay, he was one of the worst fighters to ever win a world title, and he had to drain and lose a lot of weight to fight Carl Froch in a short space of time. So I don't see that as a commendable victory, and it was a majority decision. Just taking a drink, sorry. It was a majority decision. It was a very close fight. It really, really could have gone either way. When I first watched that fight, it wasn't really a conclusive victory. It was a very close fight. It was very scrappy. Both guys landed a lot of shots. Both guys were very clumsy. And I felt that going down the stretch, Glenn Johnson just faded. He really slowed down. I mean, being 42 years old, it was expected, and being weight drained. I thought, to be honest, that fight was pretty embarrassing for Carl Froch. I thought he looked terrible in that fight. I thought that, against an old guy like Johnson, a guy who, at that stage of his career, was pretty much a journeyman. I mean, you would have expected Froch to look better than he did. I mean, Tavares Cloud did a better job against Glenn Johnson, guys, for fuck's sake. So yeah, I wasn't impressed with Froch against Johnson. I wouldn't give him too much credit for that. I mean, what would Joe Calzaghe have done with that version of Glenn Johnson? And I'll agree that Glenn Johnson was a guy that Calzaghe was actually set to fight at one point, and it would have been a good fight back then, but that was prime Glenn Johnson. The Glenn Johnson that Carl Froch fought was not prime Glenn Johnson, okay? It was a 42-year-old part-time journeyman Glenn Johnson. So yeah, Carl Froch then, of course, went on to fight Andre Ward, which is his most famous fight. He got outboxed, he got roughed up. We know what Andre Ward's all about. Andre Ward is a very awkward, difficult fucking spoiler. Just such a difficult guy to fight. I mean, how do you beat a guy like Andre Ward in America? It's damn right impossible. The guy gets away with murder. The guy has very fast hands. He's very strong. He knows what he's doing on the inside. He knows all the tricks. He's a young guy that fights like a veteran, basically. And, I didn't expect him to win that fight. I picked Andre Ward to beat Froch, and Rick and other people who used to talk to me back then on Facebook, you'll know that I told you guys from day one that Andre Ward would win that fight. And yeah, I had no doubt he was going to outbox Froch and win unanimous decision. That was my prediction all along. And it's hard to think how much credit do you give Froch for that, because it was a loss. So yeah, let's skip the Andre Ward fight now. His next fight after that was Lucien Boutte. Now, Lucien Boutte is perhaps again, alongside Mikkel Kessler, and we'll get to that later, Lucien Boutte is probably the best victory on Froch's resume, because Lucien Boutte, before that fight, was 30-0. He was the ranked number 1 fighter in the division. People forget about that. Lucien Bute was actually, Andre Ward after the Super Six was given the number one spot, but prior to the Super Six final, Lucien Bute was the number one ranked super middleweight on the planet. So that was a very commendable victory for Froch. Okay, and the way he broke Lucien Bute down, I mean, Lucien Bute was like a rabbit caught in headlights. I mean, the whole thing, the whole event, all the pressure that Carl Froch put on him, the power punching, the combinations, the setting little traps in the ring. You know, Carl Froch used all his savvy and all his experience that he picked up in the Super Six to win that fight. You know, and Lucien Bute just had never fought anybody at that level before. So yeah, you know, it was a very commendable victory for Froch. I would put Lucien Bute probably as his number one accomplishment. That was for the IBF title. He then had a showcase fight against Yusuf Mack, a fucking bum, one of the biggest bums in boxing, a faggot. That's who Yusuf Mack is, just a glass chinned, useless journeyman that was knocked out by every single decent opponent he fought. I mean, the guy was knocked out by Andrade, he was knocked out by Berrio, he was knocked out by Johnson, he was knocked out by Cloud. I mean, every single named opponent, every guy that he ever fought that you've heard of, knocked him out. So, you know, whatever, Froch beat him in 3 rounds, whatever. He was a bum. Mikkel Kessler was the rematch after that. It was for the regular WBA title and the IBF belt. So that was Froch's only unification fight of his career. Mikkel Kessler was coming off a win against Brian McGee, who at that stage of his career was completely shot. I mean, Brian McGee was almost 40. He was completely washed up. He was out of shape, and that was what ultimately lost him that fight because he couldn't take punches to the body. And Kessler took him out with some body shots in the third. And Brian McGee, you know, he had a little pot belly, and he couldn't take the body shots no more. He was too old and out of shape. So, you know, he was brought in to lose. He was brought in to be an easy way to a title for Mikkel Kessler. So yeah, Mikkel Kessler going into that fight, in my opinion, was a completely washed up fighter. It was his last ever fight. Again, he was having eye trouble. You know, there's all kinds of reports of him getting outboxed in sparring by people like Patrick Nielsen and George Groves. You know, Kessler going into that final fight against Froch, he was not himself. He was done at that point. You know, Kessler was washed up. And the funny thing is, it was a close fight. It was a very competitive fight. Kessler was able to drag Froch into the trenches and really bang it out with him. And that fight took a lot out of Froch. Okay, he wasn't the same after that. So yeah, you know, that was a close fight, a competitive fight. You know, Mikkel Kessler, a washed up Mikkel Kessler was able to give Froch a close fight. This is the same Kessler, as I said before, who at his prime was dominated by Joe Calzaghe, was completely schooled. And then Froch went on to fight George Groves, who was, George Groves was a good, 19-0. I believe he was was he the European champion? No, I don't think so. I think he might have been. I can't remember. He might have been I think it was the British and Commonwealth champion. Groves was a good contender. He was ranked number 1 with the IBF, and but he was winning that fight. You know, he dropped Froch. He was outboxing Froch. He was clearly the better fighter in terms of his boxing skill and his athleticism. The problem is that George Groves doesn't have great stamina and he doesn't have great durability, and that was something that Carl Froch does have. You know, Carl Froch is a very battle-hardened veteran with a lot of stamina and a good engine. You know, he came forward and he was able to kind of break Groves a little bit. And now the stoppage was controversial. I think that they should have let it go on, but at the same time, I will concede that I do think that Groves was about to get stopped because he was tired, you know, and I think Froch would have just broken down the same way he broke down Lucien Bute. So yeah, I think that Froch would have stopped Groves. And then we saw in the rematch, Groves. I don't know what was up with Groves in that rematch. It was a terrible performance, but yeah, he was so sloppy in that rematch. And I think that breaking up with Adam Booth was really detrimental to Groves. I think it took away a lot of Groves' confidence because Adam Booth, was always able to bring the best out of Groves in the corner. So yeah, I think that it was a big mistake on. Well, I don't know if he even left Booth. Was it Booth that left him? I don't know. But for whatever happened there, I think it was a mistake because going into the first fight against Froch, I think if he'd had Booth in his corner, he would have had a much better chance of winning. But whatever, Froch won both the fights. Second fight was by a brutal knockout. He set the knockout up beautifully. He trained his ass off for the fight and he got the knockout. So yeah, it was a good way to end his career. It was a big pay-per-view fight. But after going through that resume, and I'm looking at, I've pulled up BoxRec here. I'm looking through it again, and I don't see where all this narrative comes from that Carl Froch supposedly fought so many better fighters than Calzaghe. I mean, like I said, Calzaghe fought several former world champions. Okay, he fought guys that were, that were very experienced veterans. I mean, he fought people like Charles Brewer, who again was a multiple-time world champion, and he had been around for a long time. He was very experienced. He'd given a lot of guys in the division all kinds of trouble. I mean, Calzaghe had fought tons of opponents like that, guys that are not easy to look good against. As I mentioned before, Saki Obika, another guy Froch ducked, and I'll prove that in another video. Carl Froch ducked the shit out of Saki Obika for a long time. He didn't want that fight. Carl Froch, there were a lot of guys that in my opinion he should have fought. He ducked Adonis Stevenson, for example, who was his IBF mandatory challenger at super middleweight. And I personally think he would have lost that fight. There were a lot of fights that Carl Froch should have took that he didn't, and I don't see this fighter who people talk about as being a road warrior who will fight anybody anywhere. I mean, he refused to fight Gennady Golovkin in a fight that would have been a huge event at Wembley. I mean, Gennady Golovkin was going to move up to 168 and challenge Froch, and he was going to come over. And that would have been a huge payday. It would have been a massive fight. Carl Froch didn't want it. He retired. He retired because of Gennady Golovkin. So yeah, he also ducked James DeGale, another mandatory. Guys, Carl Froch ducked a shitload of fights. And again, I've got another video coming. Stay tuned for it on how Carl Froch really did avoid quite a lot of fights. And this narrative about him being a road warrior who takes on all comers is not true. But yeah, this is just a resume comparison. Calzaghe has by far the better resume than Carl Froch. Okay, Calzaghe was the undisputed champion. He won the WBC, IBF, IBO, WBA, Ring Magazine super middleweight titles. He had the Ring Magazine light heavyweight title. Okay, like I said, I mean, if you want to be a numbers geek and go by numbers, Calzaghe had more fights, more knockouts. Again, Calzaghe had 46 fights with 32 knockouts, I think. And, I mean, he had almost as many knockouts as Carl Froch had fights, okay? So if you want to play it by the numbers game, then you can go by it that way. But whatever. Calzaghe, in my opinion, far better resume than Carl Froch. Let me know what you guys think, and God bless.